I've spent way too long digging through item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental details for this one. And what I ended up focusing on were the threads that genuinely don't have answers. The stuff that gets brought up once and then just vanishes from the game entirely. I cut out a lot of the more commonly discussed lore points because honestly there's tons of videos covering those already, and instead organised this around mysteries grouped by who or what they're connected to, starting with the smaller, more personal horrors before working toward the bigger cosmic stuff that the game seems to actively avoid explaining. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Let's start with something that a lot of players walk right past without thinking twice about, which is the question of what exactly happened to the people who lived in Limgrave before the shattering. The game gives you ruins everywhere, broken towers, collapsed bridges, abandoned camps, but it never really tells you who built any of it or where those people went. The Tarnished arrive in a land that's already empty, already decaying, and the game treats that emptiness as a given rather than something worth explaining. One possible reading is that the shattering itself wasn't just a political event. It was something closer to an extinction event for ordinary people. The kind who didn't have the Erdtree's blessing or a connection to the demigods, and who simply had nowhere to go when the order that protected them fell apart. There's a particular detail that points toward this being more than just abandonment. Throughout Limgrave and Caelid, you find groups of what the game calls commoners, but they're not living anywhere, they're just standing in fields or wandering roads, often hostile, often half-mad. Their dialogue, when they have any, suggests they're aware something has gone deeply wrong but can't articulate what. This suggests a population that didn't die all at once, but rather degraded slowly, losing whatever made them functional as a society until what's left is just bodies that remember how to walk and fight, but not much else. What makes this genuinely unsettling, rather than just sad, is that the game never frames this as tragedy. There's no memorial, no NPC who mourns these people, no quest that addresses what happened to them. They're treated as scenery, as obstacles, and that absence of acknowledgement is its own kind of horror. It suggests that in the world of Elden Ring, the deaths of ordinary people simply don't register on the scale that the story operates at. The demigods can wage their wars and break the world apart, and the cost to people who weren't part of that conflict is just silence. Moving from the broad to the specific, let's talk about the mausoleum knights you encounter scattered throughout the lands between, because their situation is one of those things that seems straightforward until you actually sit with it. These are knights bound to guard royal remains, riding horses that are themselves undead, carrying out a duty that long outlived any meaning it once had. The unsettling part isn't that they're guarding tombs, that's a fairly standard fantasy trope. It's that nothing in the game suggests they're aware their purpose is gone. One possible reading of the Mausoleum Knights is that they represent a kind of consciousness trapped in routine, repeating an action because the action itself has become their entire identity, separate from any goal it once served. The royal remains they guard predate the current era entirely, in some cases predate the demigods themselves. Which means these knights have been standing watch for so long that whatever kingdom or family they served has been forgotten by everyone except them, and possibly forgotten by them too, in the sense that they no longer have any context for why they're doing what they're doing. What makes this disturbing rather than just melancholy is the implication for what happens to the dead in this world generally. If knights bound to a duty can persist this long without resolution, what does that suggest about the remains they're guarding? Are those royals also still aware, in some diminished capacity, still expecting their guards to eventually let them rest, or be freed? The game gives us no closure here. No scene where a Mausoleum Knight's purpose is finally fulfilled, or where the remains they protect are addressed in any way. The player can kill the knights, sure, but the remains stay where they are. the mystery stays unresolved, and the cycle the knights were part of just stops, abruptly, without explanation. Let's pivot to something a little different. The question of the walking mausoleums themselves. Those enormous structures you find moving slowly through certain areas, releasing the spirits of fallen warriors when destroyed. On the surface, this seems like a straightforward gameplay mechanic. Kill the mausoleum, get a spirit ash. But the implications of what these things actually are get strange quickly if you think about them for more than a few seconds. A walking mausoleum isn't just a tomb, it's a tomb that moves, which means something is animating it, something is directing it, and that something has been doing this for an unknown length of time across an unknown distance. The spirits released from these mausoleums are warriors, often quite powerful ones, which suggests these structures were built specifically to contain and transport the remains of significant fighters. But transport them where? To what end? The game never shows us a destination, never shows us anyone receiving these mausoleums or having any stake in where they end up. One possible reading here points towards something almost bureaucratic in its horror. The idea that somewhere in the Lands Between's history there was a system for collecting and relocating the remains of the dead. A system that has long since lost whoever was operating it, leaving these mausoleums to wander aimlessly, still following routes that no longer lead anywhere meaningful. They're not guardians like the Mausoleum Knights, they're cargo that never arrived, still in transit centuries after the delivery was supposed to happen. Now let's talk about something that tends to get glossed over, which is the question of what's actually happening with the various spirits you encounter throughout the world, separate from the named characters whose stories get more attention. I'm talking about the generic ghostly figures, faint and translucent, that appear in certain locations performing repetitive actions, sometimes hostile, sometimes just present. These aren't fully developed characters with names and dialogue, they're closer to background elements, but their existence raises questions the game never directly addresses. If these spirits are echoes of people who died in these locations, repeating their final moments or some significant action from their lives, that suggests a kind of psychic residue left behind by trauma, something that imprints onto a location and persists long after the person themselves is gone. This points toward death in the Lands Between not being a clean separation, but something messier, where a person's consciousness, or some fragment of it, can get stuck, repeating without resolution. What's disturbing about this interpretation is the sheer scale of it. If this happens to people who die under the right or wrong circumstances, then the world should theoretically be full of these echoes, far more than the game actually shows us, which raises the question of what determines whether someone leaves this kind of imprint, and what happens to the echoes that aren't in locations players visit. Are there places saturated with these things, areas the game simply doesn't take us to, where the dead are stuck on repeat, indefinitely, forgotten by everyone, unable to stop? Let's shift focus now to something connected to the broader theme of memory and forgetting, the strange case of certain NPCs who seem to not fully understand their own circumstances. There are multiple characters scattered throughout the game who express confusion about where they are, how long they've been there, or what they're even doing, in ways that go beyond typical Lost Traveler dialogue. This isn't just flavor text, it suggests something is actively interfering with these characters' ability to retain information about their own situation. One possible reading connects this to the broader concept of the Erdtree's influence on death and memory throughout the Lands Between. If the natural order of dying, moving on, and being forgotten has been disrupted on a massive scale, then perhaps what we're seeing with these confused NPCs is a kind of partial death, where someone has died enough to lose their grip on continuity and context, but not enough to actually leave. They're stuck in a liminal state, aware enough to interact, to speak, to have opinions, but unable to form new memories that stick, repeating questions, forgetting answers, existing in a permanent present without a past they can access. This becomes more unsettling when you consider how many NPCs throughout the game exhibits some version of this. It's not isolated to one or two characters, it's a pattern, which suggests this isn't a unique curse affecting specific individuals, but rather a systemic condition affecting potentially huge portions of the population. The game never frames this as a disease or a curse with a name. It's just how things are. Background noise that players might not even notice. Because it's so widespread, it starts to feel normal. Now, here's something that connects to a much larger thread, but rarely gets discussed in isolation. The question of what's actually inside the various sealed-off areas throughout the lands between that the game gestures toward but never lets you fully access. I'm not talking about areas that are simply locked behind progression gates. I mean areas where the game's environmental storytelling implies something significant is there. Doors that seem important, structures that seem purpose-built for containing something, but where entering doesn't reveal anything that explains the build-up. One example worth sitting with is the way certain ruins are structured with what appear to be containment features. Thick walls, narrow access points, designs that prioritize keeping something in or out over any practical living purpose. When you actually explore these spaces, sometimes what you find doesn't match the scale of the architecture. Smaller enemies than the space would suggest, or nothing at all, just empty rooms that seem built for something larger. This points toward the possibility that whatever these spaces were originally built to contain is no longer there, has either escaped, been removed, or ceased to exist in a form that would still be present. The architecture remains as evidence of a problem that was once significant enough to warrant this level of construction. But the problem itself, whatever it was, has been resolved in a way that left no trace. Which raises the obvious and uncomfortable question. If it escaped, where did it go? If it was removed, who removed it, and why isn't that mentioned anywhere? And if it simply stopped existing, what could cause something dangerous enough to need this kind of containment to just disappear without anyone recording how? Let's move towards something more character-specific now, focusing on the smaller mysteries surrounding minor NPCs whose fates are left genuinely ambiguous. Not in the sense of having multiple confirmed outcomes depending on player choice, but in the sense of just trailing off entirely. There are several characters throughout the game who you can interact with for a while, who have their own small arcs, and then who simply stop appearing, with no death confirmation, no dialogue acknowledging their absence, nothing. One reading of this pattern is that it reflects something thematically consistent with how the game treats the passage of time and the inevitability of loss without closure. Not every story gets an ending. Not every person you meet gets a resolution. Some just fade out of your life and you never find out what happened to them. This is arguably more realistic than tidy narrative closure, but it's also genuinely unsettling in a game that otherwise goes to great lengths to provide item descriptions and lore details for nearly everything. What makes certain instances of this particularly disturbing is when the NPC in question was clearly built up as having some significance, some connection to a larger thread, and then that thread just doesn't go anywhere. It suggests either content that was planned and cut, which is always a possibility with a game this size, or a deliberate choice to leave certain characters as permanently incomplete, existing in the world as fragments of stories that were never meant to be finished, mirroring the fragmented nature of the world itself. Shifting now to a mystery that's more environmental than character-based, let's talk about the various locations throughout the lands between, where you find what appears to be evidence of conflict, bodies, broken weapons, signs of a battle, but where no NPC, item description, or piece of lore actually explains what that conflict was or who was involved. These aren't the major battle sites tied to known historical events. They're smaller, scattered, almost incidental. One possible reading of these unexplained battle sites is that they represent the countless small conflicts that happen in a world without centralized order, skirmishes between groups that history, even the fragmented history the game gives us, never bothered to record. Not every fight matters to the broader narrative, And the game seems to acknowledge this by including evidence of violence that exists purely as environmental detail, without context, without resolution. But there's a more unsettling angle here too. Some of these sites include details that suggest the combatants weren't fighting each other in any conventional sense, positioning that implies a group turning on itself, or fighting something that left no body behind. This points toward conflicts driven by something other than straightforward warfare, paranoia, madness, the influence of something that turned allies into enemies without any external attacker being present at all. The game shows you the aftermath and lets you draw your own conclusions, but the conclusions available aren't comforting ones. Now let's talk about the question of what's actually happening with the various puppet enemies you encounter, particularly in certain southern regions, the ones that seem mechanical or constructed rather than organic, but which still bleed, still seem to feel pain, still react in ways that suggest some kind of awareness. These aren't fully robotic in the sense of being purely mechanical, but they're not straightforwardly alive either, occupying a strange middle ground the game never clarifies. One reading suggests these puppets represent attempts, possibly by eternal cities or similarly ancient civilizations, to create labour or soldiers that wouldn't require the same considerations as living beings, but that the process used to animate them involved something that left them with enough residual awareness to suffer, without enough autonomy to do anything about it. If true, this points toward a horror that's almost industrial in nature. Beings created specifically to be used up, designed without regard for whether they could feel anything about that usage. And apparently, they could. What makes this particularly disturbing is the scale implied. If puppets exist as a category, not as unique creations, but as a type of thing that was made repeatedly, then there were presumably many of them, used for whatever purpose they were created for, and what we encounter as enemies might just be the ones that survived, or that ended up in places where they continued operating long after whoever made them stopped caring, stopped maintaining them, stopped acknowledging they existed at all. The ones we fight could be the lucky ones, if you can call ongoing existence in this state lucky, compared to whatever happened to the ones that didn't make it this far. Let's talk now about a mystery connected to scale and geography, specifically the question of what's actually below certain areas of the map that the game implies exist but never lets you fully explore. There are multiple points throughout the lands between where the environment suggests significant depth, openings, shafts, areas where light doesn't reach, but where the actual explorable space doesn't match the apparent scale of what's being suggested. One possible reading is that the lands between, as explorable by the player, represents only a fraction of the actual depth of this world, and that what exists below isn't simply unexplored content, but content that was deliberately gestured toward and then not delivered, either for narrative reasons or because the implications of what's down there would be too disruptive to the story being told. The game wants you to know there's more beneath your feet, without wanting you to actually confirm what that more consists of. This becomes more unsettling when you consider the few instances where the game does let you go deep, areas that are explicitly subterranean, and how those areas tend to be among the most disturbing in the entire game, both visually and tonally. If those confirmed depths are this unsettling, the implication is that the unconfirmed depths, the ones the game only hints at, could be even worse, and the choice not to show them isn't an oversight, it's a kind of restraint, an acknowledgement that some things are scarier left to implication than shown directly. Now here's something that connects multiple threads we've touched on, the broader question of what's happening with the concept of death throughout the lands between on a fundamental level, separate from any specific character or location. The game establishes early on that death doesn't function the way players might expect, the Tarnished doesn't permanently die, certain characters return after apparent deaths, and the natural cycle of death and rebirth has been disrupted by the Erdtree's influence. One possible reading of this disruption is that it's not just affecting major characters, or the Tarnished specifically, but represents a fundamental break in how reality itself processes the end of life, affecting everything and everyone, just to different degrees and in different ways depending on proximity to the Erdtree's influence, connection to grace, or other factors the game never fully explains. This would mean that everything we've discussed, the confused NPCs, the lingering spirits, the mausoleum knights still guarding tombs centuries past relevance, are all symptoms of the same underlying problem, just manifesting differently based on circumstances. What makes this particularly disturbing is the implication for anyone or anything that existed before this disruption began, and what happens to anything that exists after it's eventually resolved, if it ever is. The game's ending choices gesture toward different possibilities for the future of the Erdtree and its influence, but none of them directly address what happens to all the things currently caught in this broken state. The spirits, the confused NPCs, the knights still guarding empty purposes. Do they get released? Do they simply continue, unaffected by whatever happens at the macro level? The game doesn't say, and that absence feels less like an oversight and more like an admission that some problems don't have clean solutions, that you can change the rules going forward without doing anything for everyone already caught in the old ones. Let's move on to something more specific now, focusing on certain item descriptions that reference events or entities that never appear anywhere else in the game. Not as enemies, not as NPCs, not as locations, just as text, existing only in the brief description of an item the player might never even read. These references are scattered and easy to miss, but collectively they suggest a much larger body of history and incident that the game simply doesn't have room for, or chooses not to make room for. One possible reading of these orphaned references is that they represent genuine world-building depth, the game's writers creating a history so extensive that not everything could make it into the actual playable content, leaving traces in item flavor text as a kind of archaeological layer beneath the surface of what players actually experience. This is the more mundane explanation, and probably the most likely one in terms of actual development reality. But there's another angle worth considering, which is what it means thematically that the game chooses to include these references at all, rather than simply not mentioning things that don't have payoffs. The decision to include a reference to something with no further explanation is itself a choice, and it creates an effect. The sense that the world is bigger than what's shown, that there's more history than any single playthrough could possibly uncover, and that some of that history involves things significant enough to warrant mention, but not significant enough, from whatever perspective wrote these descriptions, to warrant explanation. It's the textual equivalent of someone mentioning something in passing and then changing the subject before you can ask a follow-up question. Now let's talk about a mystery connected to one of the more visually striking but narratively underexplained elements of certain regions: the presence of structures or formations that don't match the architectural style of anything around them, that seem to belong to a different time period, a different civilization, or possibly something not built by any civilization the game otherwise references at all. These out-of-place elements are easy to walk past because the game is full of strange visuals, but their specific strangeness, the way they don't fit even by the standards of an already strange world, suggests something the game is deliberately not addressing. One possible reading of these anomalous structures is that they represent remnants of something that predates not just the current era, but predates the eras the game's lore otherwise discusses, going back to before the demigods, before the Erdtree's current form, possibly before whatever came before that. If the Lands Between has a history stretching back far enough, there could be multiple layers of civilizations and ages, each one largely erased by whatever came after, with only the most durable physical remnants surviving, stripped of any context because the people who could have provided that context are so far removed from the current era that even their existence has been forgotten. This becomes genuinely disturbing when you consider what it means for the scale of time we're dealing with. and what it implies about the things that have been forgotten, not through some specific curse or magical effect, but simply through the ordinary erosion of time. The same thing that happens to all history eventually, except here it's happening to a world where powerful beings and significant magic exist, which raises the question of why none of that power was apparently enough to preserve any record of whatever came before. If gods and demigods can't ensure their own history survives indefinitely, what hope does anyone else have? And what does it say about the things that have been lost that even the powerful couldn't or didn't preserve them? We're going to shift gears here and talk about a mystery that's more about absence than presence, specifically the question of why certain creature types that clearly should exist based on environmental and ecological logic simply don't appear anywhere in the game. This is a strange thing to focus on, the absence of something, but once you start noticing it, it becomes hard to ignore. Certain niches in the ecosystem that should logically be filled by something, based on what else exists, but where the game is simply silent. One possible reading of these ecological gaps is that they represent deliberate omissions, things that were considered too disturbing, too tonally inconsistent, or too narratively complicated to include, even in a game that doesn't shy away from disturbing content generally. If something was cut for being too much even for this game, that itself tells you something about what it might have been, and the absence becomes its own kind of evidence, a negative space shaped like whatever was removed. There's also a reading that connects this to the broader themes of extinction and loss that run throughout the game. Maybe these gaps aren't omissions in the sense of content that was planned and cut, but represent things that existed within the world's fiction and simply don't exist anymore, victims of whatever catastrophes shape the current state of the lands between, leaving gaps in the ecosystem that nothing has filled, because whatever could have filled them is also gone. The world feels emptier than it should, not because of development constraints, but because the fiction itself describes a world that has lost more than it's kept, and the empty niches are just one more way that loss manifests, quietly, without anyone in-game commenting on it, because there's no one left who remembers what used to be there. Let's talk now about something connected to communication, specifically the question of why so many NPCs throughout the game seem to be speaking past each other, giving responses that don't quite match what the player asked, or referencing information the player has no way of having, as if they're having a conversation with someone else entirely, someone who isn't there. This happens often enough that it can't entirely be chalked up to clunky dialogue writing, and the pattern itself becomes part of the mystery. One possible reading of this disconnection is that it reflects the broader theme of isolation that runs throughout the game, characters so cut off from genuine connection that even their conversations are performances, going through the motions of dialogue without actually communicating, responding to an idealized or expected version of whoever they're talking to, rather than the actual person in front of them. This would mean the disconnection isn't a bug, it's the point. Every conversation in the game is slightly off, because genuine connection has become impossible in this world, and what's left is just the shape of conversation without its substance. But there's a stranger possible reading too, one that's harder to dismiss once you consider it. What if some of these NPCs actually are talking to someone else? Not the player, but someone or something the player can't perceive. Ghosts of previous conversations, echoes of people who asked these same questions before, and are still, in some sense, present, overlapping with the current moment in ways that create these mismatches. If time and death don't work normally in this world, maybe conversation doesn't either, and what feels like an NPC not quite responding to you is actually an NPC responding to someone else, someone from a different point in time, layered on to the same physical space and the same dialogue tree, with you and that other person both technically present but unable to fully perceive each other. Now let's address something that connects to the very beginning of the game and tends to get less attention than it probably deserves. The question of what exactly the Tarnished were doing, and where they were during all the time between losing their grace and being called back to the lands between. The game's framing suggests this was a significant period, long enough for the Tarnished to be considered exiled, long enough for the lands between to undergo massive changes. But the game gives us almost nothing about this period from the Tarnished's perspective. One possible reading is that this gap is deliberately left empty, because filling it would undermine the player's ability to project themselves onto the Tarnished, that the blankness of this period is a feature, allowing the player character to be defined by their actions going forward rather than constrained by a backstory. This is probably the most practical explanation, consistent with how player characters often work in games that prioritize player agency. But thematically, there's something else worth considering, which is what it means that the world the Tarnished returned to has no record of where they went either. If the Tarnished were exiled, presumably to somewhere, and that somewhere isn't discussed, isn't referenced, doesn't seem to have any connection to anything else in the game's lore, it raises the question of whether exile in this context means something more total than simply being sent away. What if the place the Tarnished went isn't a place at all in any conventional sense? What if losing your grace doesn't just mean losing a blessing, but means being removed from the world's continuity entirely, existing in some kind of non-place until called back? Which would explain why neither the Tarnished nor anyone else has any of where that exile actually was. Because there was nowhere, just an absence, until the moment of return reintroduced the Tarnished into existence as something that had always been here, retroactively, without anyone, including the Tarnished themselves, being able to account for the gap. Let's move towards something more specific again, focusing on the mystery of certain weapons and items that are described as belonging to specific individuals. Individuals who otherwise don't appear in the game in any form. No body, no spirit, no reference beyond the item description itself. These items exist as evidence of a person who, as far as the playable game is concerned, might as well never have existed at all, except for this one object that bears their name or describes their use of it. One possible reading of these orphaned items is straightforward, again pointing toward world-building depth that exceeds what's actually shown. Named individuals who exist purely as flavour for the items associated with them. Never intended to appear as characters, because their role in the world's fiction was always just to have owned this thing, once, before whatever happened to them happened. But there's a more unsettling angle here too, particularly when you consider how the player actually acquires some of these items, found on bodies, in chests, in locations that don't otherwise connect to the named individual in any way. If an item belonging to someone ends up somewhere with no other connection to that person, it suggests either that the item travelled. Through means the game doesn't explain, theft, trade, looting, or that the person themselves travelled to this location and died here, anonymously, leaving behind only this one object as evidence they were ever anywhere at all. Every unexplained item is potentially the last trace of someone's entire existence. A single sentence of description standing in for a whole life and death that the game has no other record of, and the player picks it up, reads the description if they bother to, and moves on, never to think about that person again, who is now perhaps thought about, however briefly, for the first and only time since their death, by a player who doesn't even know their name was meant to mean anything. That covers a lot of the smaller scale, more personal mysteries scattered throughout the world. The kind of thing that's easy to walk past without a second thought. Now we're going to shift toward mysteries connected to specific regions, starting with Caelid, because Caelid as a whole functions almost like one big unsolved mystery that the game gestures toward more than it explains. The basic facts the game gives you about Caelid are that it was struck by some kind of scarlet rot outbreak, connected to General Radahn's battle with Malenia, and that this outbreak has rendered most of the region uninhabitable, its population either dead, transformed, or driven mad. This much is relatively clear. What's less clear is the timeline, the actual sequence of events, and crucially, what Caelid was like before this happened, because the game gives you almost nothing about pre-rot Caelid beyond a few scattered references. One possible reading of this gap is that Caelid's before state simply isn't important to the story being told. The region exists in the game as a post-catastrophe space, and that's its function, regardless of what it used to be. But this reading sits uneasily alongside the sheer scale of what's implied. An entire region, with its own cities, its own population, its own culture presumably, reduced to this state. And the game treating that reduction as background rather than as the centerpiece of a tragedy. What makes Caelid specifically disturbing as a mystery isn't just what happened, which is at least partially explained, but the question of how long it's been happening, and whether it's still happening, getting worse, in ways that aren't visible on the timescale of the player's visit. The scarlet rot is described as spreading, as something that can be contained but not necessarily cured, which raises the question of what Caelid looks like further down the line, after the events of the game, assuming the rot continues to spread at whatever rate it's been spreading. Is the entire region eventually consumed? Does it spread beyond Caelid's borders into neighbouring areas? The game shows you Caelid at one specific moment, but that moment is explicitly described as part of an ongoing process, and the endpoint of that process is never shown, never even strongly hinted at, just left as an open question hanging over the entire region. Connected to Caelid specifically, let's talk about the question of what's actually happening with Radahn's body, and the ritual surrounding it that the player eventually witnesses or participates in. The game establishes that Radahn has been holding back the stars or holding back some kind of cosmic event through sheer force of will, even after succumbing to the rot, which itself is a strange enough concept, but the specifics of how this is happening and what it means for Radahn as a person are left deliberately vague. One possible reading of Radahn's situation is that what we're seeing isn't really Radahn anymore in any meaningful sense, that the person he was died when the rot took hold, and what remains is something closer to a function, a role he's performing because of decisions made before his death. His body and whatever remains of his will repurposed into essentially a cosmic anchor with no remaining awareness of what's happening or why. If true, this means Radahn has been, for some unknown period of time, existing purely as a mechanism, not a person, with whatever happens to end this state being less a death and more a decommissioning of something that stopped being alive a long time before the player ever arrives. But there's another reading that's arguably worse, which is that some part of Radahn is still aware, still present within whatever remains of his body, fulfilling this function not automatically, but through continued, conscious effort, every moment, an active choice to keep holding on, surrounded by the rot, by whatever ritual is being performed around him, fully cognizant of his situation, but unable to do anything except continue, because stopping means consequences he's apparently decided are worse than this. If this reading is closer to the truth, then everything the player does in this location isn't interacting with a body or a relic, it's interacting with someone who has been suffering, consciously, for an extended period, and whose situation the player either ends or doesn't. But either way, the game never lets you actually communicate with him about it, never lets you ask if this is what he wants, never gives him a voice in his own ending. Let's pivot now to a different region, focusing on the Altus Plateau, and specifically the question of what's actually happening with the various groups of soldiers you encounter there, who seem to be engaged in some kind of ongoing conflict or patrol pattern that the game implies has been going on for a significant period, but where the actual stakes of this conflict, who's fighting whom and why, are left mostly unaddressed beyond surface-level faction identification. One possible reading of these unexplained military presences is that they represent the remnants of larger conflicts that have lost their original purpose but continue out of institutional momentum, similar to the Mausoleum Knights we discussed earlier, but on a larger scale, entire groups of soldiers still following orders, still maintaining positions, still fighting when provoked, because that's what they've always done, with whoever originally gave those orders long gone, and no one left with the authority to issue new ones, not even an order to stand down. What's particularly unsettling about this, on a larger scale, is the question of supply. Soldiers need food, equipment, replacement gear when things break, and if these groups have been maintaining positions for as long as the game's broader timeline suggests is plausible, where is any of that coming from? Either there's some support structure the game doesn't show us, which raises questions about what that structure is and who's running it, or these soldiers have found some way to sustain themselves that doesn't require normal supply lines, which, given everything else we've discussed about the strange relationship between life, death and sustenance in this world, might not require them to eat or sleep or replace equipment in the way living soldiers normally would. Meaning these aren't just soldiers without orders, they're soldiers who may not entirely be soldiers anymore in any biological sense, just patterns of behaviour wearing armour, occupying positions, fighting when triggered, indefinitely, without any of the needs that would normally limit how long such a situation could persist. Now let's address something connected to Leyndell, the capital, and specifically the question of what happened to its population during whatever event led to its current state, mostly empty, populated by hostile remnants and a small number of NPCs who seem disconnected from any larger community. A capital city implies a significant population, infrastructure, all the trappings of a functioning society, and the game shows you the infrastructure. The buildings are still there, but the population is essentially gone, with no clear explanation of where they went, or what happened to them specifically. One possible reading connects this to the broader pattern we've already discussed regarding Limgrave's missing population, but on a larger and more centralised scale. If Limgrave's commoners degraded into the wandering, hostile figures the player encounters, Leyndell's population might have undergone something similar, except concentrated in a capital city. The degradation could have happened faster, more visibly, possibly even violently, with whatever remained of the population either fleeing, being killed, or transforming into the various hostile entities the player fights throughout the city's streets and buildings. What makes this particularly disturbing is the scale and the silence around it. A capital city's population disappearing or transforming should be a significant historical event, something other characters throughout the game would reference, mourn, or at least acknowledge happened, but Leyndell's emptiness is treated, again, as a given, as the state the player finds it in, rather than as the aftermath of something that should have profoundly affected everyone connected to this place. It's possible that this event was so catastrophic, so total, that there was simply no one left in a position to record it happening. The people who could have told this story were among the people it happened to, and whatever remains, the buildings, the scattered hostile figures, the handful of surviving NPCs who don't talk about it, is all that's left. Not because the event wasn't significant, but because it was significant enough to eliminate everyone who could have made it part of the historical record. Let's talk about something connected to the crumbling Farum-Azula region, specifically the question of what this place actually represents in terms of time and space. Because the game's environmental storytelling here is unusually aggressive about implying something is deeply wrong with the basic rules of reality in this location, more so than almost anywhere else in the game, but without ever directly explaining what that wrongness consists of. One possible reading of Farum-Azula is that it represents a location where the normal flow of time has broken down entirely, not just slowed or sped up, but fractured, with different points in this location's history existing simultaneously, layered on top of each other in ways that don't follow any logical sequence. This would explain the visual presentation, structures that seem to exist in multiple states at once, areas that seem to loop back on themselves, a general sense of spatial and temporal incoherence that the game doesn't explain, but clearly intends. What makes this disturbing isn't just the strangeness of the location itself, but the question of what it would be like to actually live through whatever happened here. If the breakdown of time happened gradually enough that people were present for it, did they experience it as a sudden shift, or as something that crept in slowly, until they couldn't tell anymore which moment they were in, whether something had already happened or was about to happen, whether the person they were talking to was someone from their present or an echo from their past or future, overlapping with no warning and no way to distinguish. If anyone survived the actual event that caused this, in whatever form survival means here, what would their experience of time even be like now? And is it possible that some of the things the player encounters in this location, the strange, displaced enemies, the environmental details that don't quite make sense, are exactly that? People or things still experiencing this temporal breakdown, unstuck not just from a single moment, but from the entire concept of sequential time, existing in a permanent, directionless now that includes every moment of this location's history and possibly future, all at once, with no way out, and, from their perspective, possibly no awareness that there ever was a way things were supposed to be. Now, here's a mystery connected to the broader question of scale that I think doesn't get enough attention. The question of why so many of the game's most significant locations seem to exist in isolation, disconnected from any kind of broader infrastructure that would be necessary for them to function as the game implies they once did. Major sites throughout the lands between, ones that clearly housed significant populations or served significant purposes, often exist with no visible connection to other locations beyond the paths the player walks. No roads that make sense for trade, no infrastructure for resource movement, nothing that would allow these places to actually sustain themselves long term. One possible reading is that this disconnection reflects the actual state of the world at the time the game takes place, not how things always were, but how things have become, after whatever connections once existed have been severed, by the shattering, by the various conflicts and catastrophes that have occurred, leaving these locations as isolated islands that used to be part of something larger but no longer are. This would mean the isolation itself is evidence of loss, not of how these places were designed, but of how much has been cut away from around them. But there's a more unsettling possible reading too, which is that some of these locations were never connected in the way their scale implies they should have been, that they represent attempts to build something whose ambitions exceeded what was actually sustainable, grand designs that were perhaps never fully realised, or that were realised but immediately began to fail, because the infrastructure to support them was never actually completed. If true, this would mean some of what the player explores isn't the ruins of something that once worked and then broke, but the remains of something that may never have fully worked at all. Ambitious projects abandoned partway through. Their grandeur a kind of monument to overreach rather than to past success. Populated by whoever was already there when the project stalled, left to make do in a space built for something larger than what they could actually sustain or use. Let's talk now about something connected to the question of language and communication on a broader scale. Specifically the fact that despite the wide variety of factions, regions, and even species the player encounters throughout the lands between, there's remarkably little indication of any language barrier anywhere. Everyone the player can communicate with speaks the same language, or at least a language the player understands. Regardless of how isolated their community might be, how different their culture seems, or how disconnected they are from anywhere else. One possible reading of this lack of language diversity is purely practical. Games need players to understand dialogue, and modelling realistic linguistic diversity would create more problems than it solves from a design perspective. This is almost certainly true on some level, but thematically, it's worth considering what it would mean if this uniformity isn't just a design convenience, but reflects something about how this world actually works. If everyone speaks the same language despite the apparent isolation of various communities, it suggests either that this isolation is more recent than it appears, with shared language being a holdover from a time when these communities were more connected, or that language itself in this world isn't something that diverges naturally the way it does in our world, possibly connected to the Erd Tree's influence in ways the game doesn't elaborate on. a kind of imposed uniformity that prevents the natural drift of language even as everything else about these communities has drifted apart. If the latter is true, it raises the question of what it would mean for language to diverge here. What would happen if two groups, isolated long enough, eventually stopped being able to understand each other? Would that represent some kind of final severing? A sign that whatever force maintains this uniformity has finally failed for that particular connection? And if so, are there places in the lands between where this has already happened? Communities that have gone silent, not because everyone died, but because they're still there, still speaking, just not in any way that anyone outside could understand anymore. Now let's address a mystery connected to the various festivals and ritual gatherings the player encounters or hears about throughout the game. Events that seem to involve significant portions of a community's population, often with disturbing undertones, but where the actual purpose or origin of these events is left largely unexplained beyond their current, often violent, manifestation. One possible reading of these festivals is that they represent traditions that have persisted long past whatever their original meaning was. Similar to other patterns we've discussed, actions continuing because they've always been done, with the actual purpose forgotten even by the people performing them, leaving only the form of the ritual, the violence, the gathering, without the context that would explain why any of it matters. But festivals specifically raise an additional question that other persisting patterns don't: the question of participation. A mausoleum knight guarding a tomb is one entity, continuing alone. A festival requires multiple people choosing, or being compelled, to participate, year after year, generation after generation, in something that's become disconnected from its original meaning. This raises the question of how a community sustains a tradition like this across that kind of time span without anyone questioning it. Without the tradition either dying out naturally as people stop participating, or evolving into something new as people reinterpret it for changing circumstances. One possible reading is that some of these festivals aren't actually being sustained by ongoing community participation in any normal sense, but represent something closer to what we discussed regarding spirits and echoes. Communities that are themselves caught in some kind of loop, repeating not just an individual action, but an entire collective ritual. The same people, in whatever state they currently exist in, performing the same festival indefinitely, with new participants not actually being new, but being the same people, again, unaware that they've done this before, unaware that they'll do it again. Caught in a celebration that never actually ends, just repeats, with each iteration feeling, to its participants, like the only time it's ever happened. Let's shift now to a mystery connected to the question of scale on an individual level, specifically the strange size variations you encounter throughout the game. Not just the obvious giants and small creatures, but the more subtle inconsistencies. NPCs who seem larger or smaller than their apparent role would suggest. Architecture built for beings of a different size than the ones currently using it. Doorways and furniture that don't match the proportions of the people the game shows living in these spaces. One possible reading of these scale inconsistencies is that they represent layers of habitation, similar to the layered civilizations we discussed regarding anomalous structures, with current inhabitants making use of spaces built by or for beings of different proportions, adapting as best they can to architecture that wasn't designed with them in mind. This would be consistent with a world that has seen multiple waves of different beings rising and falling, each leaving behind structures that outlast them, structures the next wave inherits without necessarily being equipped to use as intended. But there's a more specific and unsettling angle worth considering, which is what this means for the beings whose proportions don't match their environment. If you're living in a space built for beings significantly larger or smaller than yourself, that's not just an aesthetic mismatch, it affects everything: how you move, what you can reach, where you can go safely, what represents danger versus safety. A space built for giants, inhabited by beings of more typical size, would be full of obstacles, drops, and hazards that wouldn't register as such to the original inhabitants, but that represent constant low-level danger to whoever's living there now. This suggests that for many of the communities the player encounters, simply existing in their environment involves a kind of perpetual, low-grade hazard that's never directly addressed, because it's just background reality, the water you swim in, not something anyone comments on, because everyone's lived with it their whole lives. The way someone living near a cliff edge their whole life might stop consciously registering the danger, even as it remains, every day, exactly as dangerous as it ever was. Now here's something connected to the question of names, specifically the pattern throughout the game of titles and names that seem to refer to roles or positions rather than individuals, but where multiple different entities throughout the game seem to share or have shared the same title, with no clear indication of how titles get assigned, transferred, or what happens to a title when whoever held it is gone. One possible reading is that certain titles in this world function less like names and more like positions that get filled, possibly automatically, possibly through some process the game doesn't show, whenever the previous holder is no longer able to fulfill the role. This would explain why multiple entities throughout the game's history seem to share titles. They're not the same individual, they're different individuals who held or hold the same position, with the title itself being the constant, passed along, while the person behind it changes. What's disturbing about this, if true, is the question of how this transfer happens and whether the new holder of a title has any say in becoming the new holder. If titles represent roles that need filling, and if the process for filling them doesn't require consent, that suggests a world where identity itself can be, in some sense, overwritten, where becoming the next whoever isn't a choice or an honour, but something that happens to you, possibly without your awareness, possibly against your will, with your own identity, your own name, becoming secondary to the role you've now been assigned. A role that existed before you will exist after you, and that, while you hold it, may increasingly define how others perceive and interact with you, until the person you were before becomes as forgotten as everything else we've discussed, replaced not by death exactly, but by function, the title outlasting the individual, the way the Mausoleum Knight's duty outlasted any memory of who they originally served. Let's talk now about a mystery connected to colour and visual presentation specifically. The question of why certain locations, items, and even characters throughout the game are associated with specific colours in ways that seem deliberate, but where the actual significance of these colour associations is left for the player to infer without any direct explanation. One possible reading of these colour associations is that they function as a kind of visual shorthand for concepts the game doesn't want to state directly. Certain colours becoming associated with certain themes or states of being through repeated visual reinforcement, without any character ever saying this colour means this, allowing the game to communicate on a level that operates below explicit narration, something the player absorbs without necessarily being consciously aware they're absorbing it. But this raises the question of what happens when these colour associations appear in contexts that don't have any other explanation. When something is presented in a way that visually codes it as connected to a theme or state the rest of its presentation doesn't support. These visual contradictions, when they occur, might represent some of the most significant unstated information in the entire game. Not contradictions at all, but clues. The visual presentation telling the truth about something that the explicit content is, for whatever reason, unable or unwilling to state directly. If you started cataloguing every instance where a location, item, or character's visual coding doesn't match its explicit narrative role, what pattern might emerge? And what would that pattern suggest about the things the game knows but isn't telling you? Encoded not in words, which can be edited, removed, or left ambiguous, but in something more fundamental to how the game looks, which exists whether or not anyone ever explains what it means. Now here's something connected to the broader question of what's happening with various messages the player encounters throughout the game. Not the multiplayer messages other players leave, but in-world messages, carved instructions, warning signs, directional markers that seem to be addressed to someone, anyone passing through, but where the content of these messages often doesn't quite match the situation the player actually finds when they arrive. One possible reading of these mismatched messages is temporal. The messages were accurate when written, describing a situation, a danger, an instruction that made sense at the time. But circumstances have since changed. The danger has passed or transformed into something else. The instruction no longer applies to the current state of things, and what the player encounters is the gap between what the message describes and what's actually there now. A kind of historical document that's become, through the simple passage of time, slightly or significantly wrong. This becomes more unsettling when you consider the messages that seem to describe something that, as far as the player can tell, never existed at all. Warnings about dangers that don't seem to be present, instructions referencing locations or features the player can't find anywhere nearby. If these messages were once accurate, what they describe existed once and has since been removed so thoroughly that the only evidence it ever existed is this message, which itself might not survive much longer, eventually eroding, becoming illegible, until even this last trace is gone, and whatever the message described will have left no evidence at all, not even a contradiction for a future visitor to notice and wonder about. Let's address a mystery connected to the question of boundaries throughout the lands between, specifically the various points where the game implies you're crossing from one kind of space into another. Fog walls, gates, transitions between regions, and the question of what these boundaries actually represent beyond their gameplay function of separating areas. One possible reading of these boundaries is that they represent more than spatial divisions, that crossing certain thresholds within this world involves a kind of transition that affects more than just your physical location, connected to the broader instability of reality we've discussed in locations like Farum Azur, but present, in subtler forms, throughout the world generally. Every boundary crossing might involve some small disruption, something left behind, something picked up, with the cumulative effect of all these crossings being part of why characters throughout the game seem so disconnected from continuity, from memory, from a stable sense of self, not because of one dramatic event, but because of the accumulated effect of crossing thresholds that were never meant to be crossed this casually, this often, by beings not equipped to handle the disruption each crossing causes. If true, this would mean the Tarnished, by virtue of travelling extensively throughout the lands between, crossing boundary after boundary in pursuit of the game's objectives, might be experiencing this disruption more acutely than almost anyone else, which raises an uncomfortable question about the player character's own reliability as a perspective. If every threshold crossed leaves some mark, some disruption to memory or continuity, and the Tarnished crosses more thresholds than almost any other character in the game, what does that mean for everything the player has experienced as the Tarnished? How much of what feels like a coherent journey is actually coherent? And how much is the player's own mind, like the minds of so many NPCs throughout the game, smoothing over gaps, filling in continuity that isn't actually there, creating the feeling of a single, continuous experience out of what might actually be a series of disconnected moments, each one slightly disrupted by the boundary that was crossed to get there, with the disruption itself being invisible to the one experiencing it, the same way a person with memory problems might not notice the gaps in their own memory. Because noticing a gap requires remembering that something should be there to fill it. Now let's talk about something connected to the concept of waiting throughout the game. The number of NPCs who are explicitly described or who imply through their dialogue and behaviour that they're waiting for something, someone, some event, with the wait itself being their primary characterisation, more significant to who they are than anything else about them. One possible reading of this prevalence of waiting is thematic, connecting to the broader sense of stagnation and unresolved tension that defines much of the world, Characters waiting, because waiting is what you do when the world itself has stopped moving forward in any meaningful sense. When the future that would resolve your wait isn't coming, but you don't know that, or won't accept that. So you wait anyway, because the alternative, accepting that what you're waiting for will never come, is worse than the wait itself. But what's particularly unsettling is considering what happens to these characters if and when whatever they're waiting for actually does arrive, in some form, through the player's actions. The player, moving through the world, completing objectives, triggering events, might inadvertently provide the arrival that some of these waiting characters have been anticipating, not necessarily in the form they expected, but in some form that fulfills technically the conditions of their wait. What happens to someone whose entire identity has been built around waiting? When the wait ends. If waiting has become who they are, ending the wait might not bring relief. It might bring a kind of dissolution, the removal of the only thing that's been holding them together, leaving nothing behind. Not satisfaction, not peace, just an absence where a person used to be. The moment their wait ends being, paradoxically, the moment they cease to exist in any recognisable form, because what they were waiting for was never actually what they wanted. It was just the thing that justified their continued existence. And once that justification is gone, so are they. Let's pivot now to a mystery connected to the question of names again, but from a different angle than before. Specifically, the prevalence of characters throughout the game who are referred to by titles or descriptions rather than personal names, even in contexts where a personal name would seem natural. Where the character is clearly an individual with their own identity, but where that identity, including their actual name, is simply never provided. One possible reading of this absence of personal names is connected to everything we've discussed about identity and forgetting throughout this world. Characters who have lost their names, not metaphorically, but actually, their names having been forgotten by others, by themselves, by the world, with what remains being only their function, their role, their description, the things about them that persisted even after the most personal piece of their identity, the thing that made them specifically them rather than just an example of a type, was lost. This raises the question of what it would take to actually lose your own name, to forget the thing that's usually considered most fundamental to a sense of self, and what it would feel like to exist in that state, knowing, perhaps, that you used to have a name, that everyone has a name, but being unable to access yours, with everyone you interact with also not knowing it, so that even if you wanted to be reminded, there's no one who could remind you. You'd exist as a gap shaped like a person, recognisable as an individual through everything except the one piece of information that would actually distinguish you. Your name, gone, with no path back to it, existing as the so-and-so or the one who does this indefinitely. A description standing in for an identity that's been lost so completely that even the loss itself isn't remembered as a loss, just as how things are, how things have always been, for someone who can't remember a time before this was true. Now here's a mystery connected to something visual and easy to miss. The question of shadows and lighting throughout certain locations, specifically instances where the lighting doesn't quite make sense given the apparent light sources. Shadows falling in directions that don't match where light appears to be coming from, or areas that seem lit despite no visible source for that light. One possible reading of these lighting inconsistencies is purely technical. Game environments often have lighting that's been adjusted for visual or performance reasons without strict adherence to physical accuracy, and most players never notice because it doesn't disrupt the overall experience. This is almost certainly the primary explanation in terms of actual development. But if you choose to read these inconsistencies as meaningful rather than incidental, what would they suggest? Light that doesn't behave the way light should, in a world where so many other fundamental things, time, death, memory, don't behave the way they should either, might be one more symptom of the same underlying instability, reality itself becoming slightly unreliable in ways that mostly go unnoticed because they're subtle, because people and players generally don't pay close attention to where shadows fall unless something draws their attention to it. If you did pay attention and started noticing these inconsistencies as a pattern rather than isolated incidents, what would that mean for your understanding of where you are? Is the world you're moving through actually as stable as it appears? Or is the appearance of stability itself something being maintained imperfectly? With these lighting inconsistencies being small cracks in that maintenance, visible only if you know to look for them, evidence that the world you're experiencing isn't quite as solid as it presents itself as being, that underneath the visible surface, something isn't quite holding together the way it's supposed to, and these small visual wrongnesses are the only outward sign, easy to dismiss, easy to never notice, but there, if you look. Let's talk about a mystery connected to sound, specifically the various ambient noises throughout the game that don't seem to have clear sources, distant sounds, echoes, things that are audible but that don't correspond to anything visible or identifiable within the immediate environment. One possible reading of these unexplained sounds is that they represent the audio equivalent of the orphaned references we discussed earlier in item descriptions, evidence of things existing beyond what the player can directly perceive, sounds travelling from locations the player hasn't been to or can't go to, giving a sense of a larger world without requiring that world to be explicitly shown or explained. But sound specifically raises a question that visual elements don't, the question of distance and travel time. Sound takes time to travel, and the further away a source is, the longer that delay. If some of these ambient sounds are coming from significant distances, what does it mean that the player can hear them at all? What conditions would allow sound to travel that far, that clearly, without significant degradation? And if the sounds aren't coming from far away, but from somewhere closer that simply isn't visible, what does that mean for the spaces the player thinks they understand? Are there spaces immediately adjacent to the ones the player explores? Spaces close enough that sound carries between them, but that remain completely hidden, populated by whatever or whoever is making these sounds, going about their existence in parallel to the player's own, never seen, never acknowledged, except through these occasional, unexplained sounds that most players probably don't even consciously register. Background noise that's actually evidence of an entire adjacent world, audible but invisible, present but unreachable, existing alongside everything the player experiences without ever being part of it. Now let's address something connected to weather and atmospheric conditions throughout the game, specifically the question of why certain regions seem to have weather patterns that don't match what their geography or other environmental details would suggest. Areas that seem like they should be one type of climate based on their visual presentation, but where the actual weather effects suggest something different entirely. One possible reading of these weather inconsistencies connects to the broader theme of disrupted natural order that runs throughout the game. Weather, like death, like time, like memory, being one more fundamental aspect of how the world works that's been thrown off from whatever its original state was, with the result being regions where the weather doesn't match the land, where storms occur in places that shouldn't have storms, where certain areas seem to exist in a kind of permanent atmospheric wrongness that the inhabitants, if there are any, have presumably had to adapt to, or have failed to adapt to, contributing to whatever state the player finds them in. This raises the question of cause and effect though. Is the weather wrong because something disrupted it directly? Some event that specifically affected atmospheric conditions? Or is the weather wrong as a downstream effect of something else? The land itself being wrong in ways that affect the weather indirectly. The wrongness of the geography producing wrongness in the atmosphere above it as a kind of side effect. And if it's the latter, what does that mean for the geography itself? What's actually happening at the level of the land beneath the weather that's significant enough to disrupt atmospheric patterns? Is there something happening underground? Something the player never sees directly, that's powerful enough to affect what happens in the sky? And if so, what would it take to actually witness that thing directly? Would going deep enough, beneath whatever's causing the weather to behave wrongly, reveal the actual source? And would that source be something that could be reasoned with, addressed, fixed? Or would it be something that's beyond any of that? Something that's simply doing what it does, with the wrong weather just being one of many effects radiating outward from whatever it is. Effects that reach the surface, reach the sky, reach everywhere, while the thing itself remains where it's always been, unseen, unaddressed, continuing. Let's talk about a mystery connected to the question of doors throughout the game, specifically locked doors, sealed doors, doors that require specific keys or conditions to open, and the question of what's actually behind some of these doors when the game does eventually let you through, versus what the build-up leading to these doors implies should be there. One possible reading of doors that don't deliver on their build-up is simply about pacing and expectation management. Not every locked door can lead to something earth-shattering, and the game including doors that lead to relatively mundane contents alongside doors that lead to significant rewards or revelations is just how exploration works. Most things you find aren't going to be the most important thing in the game. But there's a version of this mystery that's more specific and more unsettling. Instances where a door's presentation, its design, its location, the obstacles required to reach it, all suggest something significant. But where what's actually behind it, when you finally get there, seems to not match that build-up in a way that feels less like not everything can be amazing, and more like something is missing. Like the door was built for something that isn't there anymore, or that was never installed, or that was removed after the door itself was already built and sealed. If a door was built to contain or protect something specific, and that something is gone, but the door remains sealed, requiring the same effort to open as if whatever it was protecting was still there, that's a door that's become, in some sense, a lie. Not intentionally, but through circumstance, still presenting itself as significant, still requiring significant effort to access, while what's actually behind it no longer justifies that effort. And if some doors throughout the game are like this, sealed memorials to absences rather than presences, how would the player, or anyone, know the difference from the outside between a door that leads to something significant and a door that leads to nothing? To an empty room where something significant used to be, with both types of door looking. From the outside, exactly the same, equally sealed, equally significant in appearance, with the only way to know what's actually behind them being to go through. And even then, would you know? If you opened a door expecting something and found an empty room, would you recognize that emptiness as evidence of an absence? Or would you just think this was a door that this time didn't lead to anything special, never considering that it might have once, and that the emptiness you're looking at is itself the mystery, the only remaining evidence of something you'll never know anything about, because the only thing that could have told you is gone, and all that's left is the space where it used to be, and a door that took real effort to open, for nothing, except the knowledge, if you choose to read it this way, that nothing is sometimes exactly what used to be something, before it wasn't anymore. Now let's address a mystery connected to mirrors and reflections, or the conspicuous absence of them throughout the game. The fact that despite the presence of water, polished surfaces, and other elements that could theoretically produce reflections, the game very rarely shows the player character or other characters reflected in anything. One possible reading of this absence is technical. Reflections are computationally expensive, and games often limit or fake them for performance reasons, with players rarely noticing, because reflections aren't something most people actively look for while playing. But if readers meaningful, the absence of reflections throughout a world this otherwise detailed could suggest something about the nature of the beings that populate it. What if some, or many, of the characters the player encounters, including potentially the player character themselves, don't actually have reflections, not because the game doesn't render them, but because, within the fiction, there's nothing there to reflect, not in the sense of being invisible, but in the sense of not being fully present in whatever way would be required for a reflection to occur, existing in this world enough to be seen, to be interacted with, to fight and speak and exist as the player experiences them, but not existing in a way that would extend to a reflected image, the reflection requiring a kind of completeness, a kind of there-ness that these beings simply don't have. If true, this would mean that throughout the lens between, in any location with a reflective surface, anyone who looked into it wouldn't see themselves, or would see something incomplete, a suggestion of a figure rather than a clear image, and that this would be so normal, so universal, that no one comments on it, the same way no one in our world comments on the fact that they can't see. Ultraviolet light, it's simply not part of how perception works here, missing reflections being just one more absence among many. Unremarked upon, because remarking on an absence requires first noticing it, and noticing requires comparison to something that has the thing that's missing, and if nothing here has it, there's nothing to compare to, and the absence simply becomes invisible, the same way all absences eventually do, in a world where so much, as we've discussed throughout this entire video, has already been lost, forgotten, or simply never was, with no one left who would even know to look for it, or to ask where it went. Let's move into a new section now, shifting focus toward the Volcano Manor, and the operations conducted there, because the recruitment process the player goes through to join this faction raises questions that the game never circles back to address once the player has been initiated. The basic setup is that the player is recruited as an assassin, sent to eliminate specific targets scattered throughout the lands between, each of these targets being someone who has, supposedly, betrayed the manor or its interests in some way. This framing is presented matter-of-factly, but if you actually look at who these targets are, the picture gets murkier. Some of them have no apparent connection to Volcano Manor at all. No shared history, no prior interaction, nothing that would suggest betrayal in any conventional sense. One possible reading of this is that betrayal in this context isn't being used the way the player might assume, not as a personal wrong done to the manor, but as a kind of catch-all designation applied to anyone the manor has decided needs to be removed, for reasons that may have nothing to do with loyalty or disloyalty at all. If true, this would mean every target the player eliminates was given a justification, betrayal, specifically because that's the framing that gets newly recruited assassins to act without hesitation, a word chosen for its effect on the recruit rather than its accuracy regarding the target. This becomes more unsettling when you consider what it implies about the recruitment process itself and about every assassin who came before the player. If the manor has an established system for recruiting outsiders, giving them a justification, and sending them after targets, how many people have gone through this exact process, told the exact same kind of story, sent after their own list of traitors, with no way to verify any of it? No way to know if the people they're being sent to kill actually did anything at all. The player is one recruit in what might be a long, ongoing operation, and the targets the player is given might just be this batch, with other batches having existed before, and possibly continuing after, an assembly line of justified violence, where the justification is the only thing that changes from one recruit to the next, tailored to whatever story will work on whoever's been brought in this time. Let's stay with Volcano Manor, but shift to a different angle, the question of what's actually happening with the people who live and work within the manor itself, separate from the assassination targets. The manor presents itself as hosting some kind of ongoing social function, gatherings, performances, an atmosphere of refined activity, but the population doing this seems disproportionately small for the scale of what's implied, and the few NPCs the player can actually interact with give very little indication of what daily life here actually involves beyond their immediate function. One possible reading is that what the player sees represents a kind of facade, a curated version of the manor, presented specifically for visitors, recruits, and whoever else needs to be shown a particular impression, with the actual operations, whatever those are, happening elsewhere, out of sight, accessible only to those already fully integrated into whatever the manor actually is beneath its surface presentation. The player, as a new recruit, would be kept on this surface level, shown enough to be useful, but not enough to understand what they've actually become part of. What makes this specifically disturbing is the implication for the player's own position within this. If there's a deeper layer to the manual's operations that recruits aren't shown, the player has no way of knowing whether their assassination missions are actually serving the purpose they've been told, or whether they're a small, visible piece of something much larger, with the real operation continuing regardless of what the player does or doesn't accomplish. The player's actions mattering only insofar as they maintain the appearance that recruits are being given meaningful work, while the actual decisions, the actual purposes, happen somewhere the player never sees, by people the player never meets, for reasons the player will never be told, because telling them was never part of the arrangement to begin with. Now let's move toward the Carrion royal family, and the question of what actually happened to the various members of this family whose fates the game leaves scattered and largely unresolved. The game establishes that this was once a significant royal line, connected to sorcery and to the moon, but by the time the player encounters anything connected to this family, what remains are fragments. Individuals in various states of isolation, transformation, or absence, with very little connecting these fragments into anything resembling a coherent family history. One possible reading of this scattering is that it reflects a family that didn't fall all at once through a single event, but that came apart gradually, different members pursuing different paths, making different choices, some toward power, some toward isolation, some toward whatever transformations the game shows evidence of, until what was once a unified royal line became a collection of individuals who may have lost track of each other entirely, each pursuing their own trajectory without any of them necessarily being aware of what happened to the others. This raises the question of whether any of the surviving or transformed members of this family are aware of their own relation to each other, whether, if the player encounters multiple fragments of this family across different locations, those fragments would recognize each other as connected, as family, or whether enough time and transformation has passed that even that connection has been lost. Each fragment existing in isolation, not just physically, but in terms of identity, no longer thinking of themselves as part of a family at all, the family itself having become, like so much else in this world, something that used to exist and now exists only in scattered traces, recognizable as having been connected only to someone looking from outside, piecing together fragments that, to the fragments themselves, no longer feel like pieces of anything. Let's talk now about a related mystery, the question of what's actually happening with the moon itself within the context of this world's cosmology. Because the game associates the moon with specific magic, specific bloodlines and specific locations, but never actually addresses what the moon represents on a cosmic level, how it relates to the stars, to the Erd tree, to whatever the broader structure of this world's reality actually is. One possible reading is that the moon represents a kind of alternative or rival cosmic principle to whatever the Erd tree represents, not necessarily opposed in a simple good versus evil sense, but operating according to different rules, different cycles, with the bloodlines and magic associated with the moon representing access to or influence from this alternative principle, in the same way other bloodlines and magic throughout the game connect to the Erd tree or to other cosmic forces. What makes this specifically worth dwelling on is the question of cycles. The moon, in most cosmologies, is associated with cyclical change, waxing and waning, a pattern of completion and renewal that's fundamentally different from the kind of linear growth and decay associated with trees. If the moon represents this kind of cyclical principle within this world's cosmology, then whatever's connected to the moon might not experience time, change, or even death in the same linear way that the rest of the world seems to. Connected instead to something that returns, that repeats, that doesn't end so much as it cycles back around. This could explain some of what we discussed regarding the Carrion family's scattered members. If their connection to the moon means they're operating on a different temporal logic, what looks like loss or transformation from a linear perspective might, from their perspective, be part of a cycle that will eventually bring them back around to where they started, whether they want that or not. With the question being not whether this cycle will complete, but how many times it already has, unnoticed, by anyone operating on the more familiar, linear timescale that the rest of the world seems to follow. Now let's address the frenzied flame, specifically the question of its actual origin, because the game associates this force with a specific entity, a being kept beneath Lendel. But the relationship between this being and the broader concept of the frenzied flame as it manifests throughout the world is left genuinely ambiguous. Is the being the source, a conduit, a fragment of something larger, or something else entirely? One possible reading is that the being the player encounters isn't the origin point of the frenzied flame in any complete sense, but represents one access point to something that exists independent of any single location or entity. Something more like a fundamental force or principle that this being has become connected to, possibly through circumstances the game doesn't detail, rather than something this being created or controls. If true, this raises the question of what other access points might exist. If the frenzied flame isn't centered on this one entity, but is something this entity has tapped into or been tapped by, there could be other instances throughout the world's history, or even concurrently, of other beings becoming similarly connected, each one representing a separate outbreak of the same underlying force, with no necessary connection between them beyond the shared source they're all, in different ways, channeling. This becomes more unsettling when you consider the implications for containment. If the entity beneath Lendel is dealt with, in whatever way the player's actions result in, does that actually address the frenzied flame as a phenomenon? Or does it just close one access point, while the underlying force, whatever it actually is, remains available to connect with something or someone else, at some other point, in some other location, the cycle beginning again, not because anything was preserved or planned, but simply because the underlying condition that allowed this connection to happen in the first place was never actually the entity itself. It was something about the world, something that makes connections like this possible, something that doesn't go away just because one particular instance of it has been addressed. Let's shift to the Haligtree now, and specifically the question of why this location, despite being associated with healing, with a bloodline connected to addressing the rot that plagues much of the world, ended up so isolated, so difficult to reach, and ultimately so unable to fulfill whatever purpose it was apparently built for. One possible reading is that the Haligtree's isolation wasn't always total, that it represents a location that was, at some point, more accessible, more connected to the broader world, but that became isolated as a consequence of whatever it was trying to address. The rot itself, or the broader instability we've discussed throughout this video, eventually affecting even this place. Cutting it off not through any deliberate action, but as a side effect of the same forces it was meant to combat, the cure becoming, eventually, isolated by the disease. What makes this particularly significant is the question of intention versus outcome. If the Haligtree was built with a purpose, to provide healing, to address the rot, and that purpose ultimately failed, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through gradual isolation, the slow cutting off of access until the place that was supposed to help became something that needed to be found, reached, accessed through extraordinary means. Then the story of the Haligtree isn't a story of failure through opposition, it's a story of failure through erosion. The same kind of erosion that's affected so much else throughout this world. Except in this case, The thing being eroded was specifically meant to be a solution, and watching a solution erode in the same way as everything else, without any special protection or exception being made for it, suggests that whatever forces are causing this erosion throughout the lands between don't discriminate between problems and solutions, between things that need to be lost and things that desperately need to be preserved. Everything erodes the same way, given enough time, regardless of how important it was, or how badly it was needed, by whoever's left to need it. Now let's talk about Miquella specifically, separate from the broader Haligtree discussion, because the question of what Miquella actually wants, and what Miquella's current state actually consists of, remains genuinely ambiguous even after the player encounters direct evidence of Miquella's ongoing activity throughout the lands of shadow. One possible reading of Miquella's situation is that what the player encounters represents someone whose intentions, whatever they originally were, have become inseparable from the methods being used to pursue them, to the point where it's no longer meaningful to ask whether Miquella wants something in any way that resembles normal wanting, the want itself having become a kind of compulsion, operating according to its own logic, with whatever remains of Miquella's original perspective along for the ride, unable to meaningfully steer, possibly unable to even fully perceive what's being done in their name anymore. This raises a particularly uncomfortable question about agency and consent, specifically regarding the various beings the player encounters who have been affected by Miquella's actions, charmed, connected, drawn into whatever Miquella is doing. If Miquella's own agency is compromised, if what's happening isn't fully Miquella's choice in any meaningful sense, then the agency of everyone Miquella has affected is even further removed from anything resembling consent. They're not just affected by someone else's choice, they're affected by something that might not be a choice at all anymore. A process that's using Miquella, and through Miquella, using everyone connected to Miquella, toward an end that may not actually serve anyone involved, including, possibly especially, Miquella, who might be, in some sense, the first and most thoroughly affected casualty of whatever this process is, with everyone else being affected secondarily, through their connection to someone who themselves no longer has the perspective needed to recognize what's happening, let alone to stop it. Let's move toward the lens of shadow more broadly now, and specifically the question of what this location's relationship to the rest of the lands between actually is. Because the game presents this as a connected but separate space, accessible through specific means, but the actual nature of that connection, geographic, dimensional, temporal, is left deliberately unclear. One possible reading is that the lens of shadow represents something that exists adjacent to the lands between, in a way that doesn't map neatly onto normal spatial relationships. Not a place you travel to in the conventional sense, but a place that exists alongside, overlapping in ways that are usually inaccessible, but that can, under the right circumstances, be reached, entered. The boundary between the two not being a distance to cross, but a kind of permeability that opens under specific conditions. If true, this raises the question of what else might exist in similar relationships to the lands between, places that are adjacent in this non-spatial sense, that could theoretically be entered under the right circumstances, but that the game doesn't show, because the right circumstances never arise during the events depicted. The lands of shadow might not be unique in this regard. It might just be the one instance where the conditions for access happen to align with the story being told, with other similarly adjacent spaces existing, permanently inaccessible, not because of distance or obstacles, but because whatever specific conditions would allow entry simply never occur, leaving these spaces permanently sealed, not through any door or barrier, but through the simple fact that the circumstances that would open them never happen to happen, leaving them as theoretical possibilities, places that exist in some sense, but that no one will ever actually visit, because visiting requires something that, as far as anyone can tell, isn't going to occur. Now let's address something connected to the Skidoo tree and the blessing it provides throughout the lands of shadow. Specifically, the question of what this tree actually represents in relation to the Erd tree. because the game implies a connection, both being significant trees with associated blessings, but the nature of this connection, whether the Skidoo tree is a separate entity, a fragment, an opposite, or something else, is left unaddressed. One possible reading is that the Skidoo tree represents something that grew specifically in the absence of, or in opposition to, whatever the Erd tree represents, not as a deliberate creation, but as a kind of natural consequence, the way certain things only grow in shadow, in spaces where the dominant light doesn't reach. The Skidoo tree existing because the lands of shadow exist, a tree whose nature is defined by what it isn't, by what doesn't reach it, rather than by any positive quality of its own. This raises the question of what would happen to the Skidoo tree if its relationship to the Erd tree changed. If the Erd tree's influence somehow extended into the lands of shadow, or if the lands of shadow's separation from the rest of the world ended in some way, would the Skidoo tree's nature change as a result? Would it cease to be what it currently is? Not through any direct conflict, but simply through the removal of the conditions that allowed it to be what it is in the first place. If the Skidoo tree exists because of an absence, and that absence were filled, the Skidoo tree wouldn't necessarily be destroyed, but it might no longer be the Skidoo tree, might become something else entirely. Its identity is fundamentally tied to what surrounds it as to anything inherent to itself, meaning its continued existence as what it currently is depends entirely on conditions outside its own control continuing to hold, conditions that, given everything else we've discussed about instability and change throughout this world, can't necessarily be relied upon to continue indefinitely. Let's talk about Messmer now, and specifically the question of what Messmer's actual relationship to the lands of shadow has been over time. Because the game presents Messmer as having significant authority and history within this location, but the specifics of how that authority was established, maintained, and what it's actually accomplished over whatever time span is involved, remain largely unaddressed beyond the immediate circumstances the player encounters. One possible reading is that Messmer's presence in the lands of shadow represents a kind of containment effort, not containing a thing or a place, but containing information. Knowledge of this location's existence, its connection to the broader lens between, kept restricted, with Messmer's authority being less about ruling a population and more about maintaining a boundary, ensuring that whatever exists here doesn't become known, doesn't spread, doesn't connect to the wider world in ways that might have consequences the game never specifies, but that were apparently significant enough to warrant this level of effort, maintained for whatever time span is implied. What makes this particularly worth considering is the question of success versus failure in this context. If Messmer's role has been to maintain a boundary, a containment, then the player's presence here, the player having found a way in, represents in some sense a failure of that containment, regardless of how it happened. This raises the question of what containment failures like this have looked like before, if this is the first time, or if there have been others, other beings who found their way into the lands of shadow throughout whatever history this containment has had, and what happened to them. Were they removed? Did they remain? Did their presence here have consequences that rippled outward in ways that the broader lands between experienced without ever knowing the source, every strange, unexplained phenomenon we've discussed throughout this video, potentially connecting back to breaches in containment that happened here, in this isolated, shadowed place, consequences radiating outward from breaches that occurred so long ago and so quietly that by the time their effects became visible elsewhere, no one would think to connect them back to their actual source, a place most people don't even know exists. Now let's shift toward a different kind of mystery, connected to the various remembrances the player obtains from significant enemies throughout the game, specifically the question of what these objects actually represent in terms of the relationship between the enemy defeated and the item produced. Because the game's framing suggests These are memories or essences in some form, but the actual mechanism, how a memory becomes an item, what happens to whatever's left of the original being once this transfer occurs, is left unexplained. One possible reading is that what's being extracted isn't simply a memory in the sense of information, but something closer to a portion of whatever made that being what it was. A kind of essential quality, with the remembrance item representing not a record of the being's existence, but a fragment of the being itself, separated out, made portable, usable by whoever holds it. The original being continuing to exist, in whatever state defeat leaves them in. But now missing this fragment, permanently, this raises the question of what it would be like for one of these defeated beings, assuming they retain any awareness after defeat, to exist without this fragment that's been taken from them. If the remembrance represents something essential, its absence might represent a kind of permanent diminishment, the being continuing to exist, in some form, but as less than they were, missing something that can't be recovered because it's now elsewhere, in the possession of whoever defeated them, used for purposes that have nothing to do with the being it was taken from, who might, in whatever state they're in, be aware that something is missing, without being able to do anything about it, existing afterward as an incomplete version of themselves, with the missing piece carried around by someone else entirely, who likely never thinks about where it came from, or what it meant to the being it was taken from, treating it as a resource, an upgrade material, a means to an end, with no acknowledgement that what they're holding used to be part of someone, and that someone is still out there, somewhere, permanently lessened by its absence. Let's address something connected to the question of shells and discarded forms throughout the game. The various locations and items that suggest beings shedding or abandoning their physical forms, whether through transformation, ascension, or some other process, with the discarded form remaining behind, while whatever the being has become continues elsewhere. One possible reading of these discarded forms is that they represent evidence of a process that's more common throughout this world's history than the game directly states. Beings reaching points where their physical form no longer matches what they've become, or what they need to become, and shedding that form the way a creature might shed a skin, the form left behind not being a death exactly, but a kind of molting, with whatever the being has become continuing to exist, just not in a form that resembles what was left behind. This raises the question of what happens to these discarded forms afterward, whether they retain any connection to whatever the being became, whether they could, theoretically, be reactivated, reanimated, or whether they're genuinely inert, just remains. In the most literal sense, material that used to be part of something, but that no longer has any connection to it. If some of the bodies and forms the player encounters throughout the world fall into this category, discarded rather than killed, then technically, the beings these forms belong to might still exist. Somewhere, in some form, having moved on from these, remains the way someone might move out of a house, leaving behind belongings that no longer serve any purpose. Not because they died, but because they've gone somewhere these belongings can't follow, leaving the player to encounter what amounts to an empty house, full of remains that look like evidence of death, but that might actually be evidence of departure. The being that used to occupy this form having simply left, for somewhere else, sometime else, in some form that no longer requires what's been left behind. Now let's talk about the question of borrowed power throughout the game, specifically the various instances where a character's abilities or significance seem to be derived from something external to themselves, a connection, a vessel, a relationship to something larger, rather than from anything intrinsic. And what happens to these characters if that external connection is severed? One possible reading is that a significant portion of the power and significance displayed by various beings throughout the lands between isn't actually theirs in any fundamental sense, but is borrowed, channeled or granted from sources that exist separately from the beings themselves, with the beings serving as conduits or vessels for something else. Their own identity and capabilities being secondary to whatever they're connected to. This raises the question of what these beings would be like without that connection, stripped of whatever they're channeling. Would they simply become ordinary? Would they retain memory of what they were while connected? Or would the loss of connection also mean a loss of whatever made them who they were during that connection? A kind of double removal, losing both the power and the identity that came with it, becoming someone or something that doesn't remember being significant, doesn't remember the connection at all, existing afterward as essentially a different being occupying the same body, with no bridge between who they were while connected and whoever they become once that connection ends, the transition itself possibly being instant, or possibly being something that takes time, a gradual fading, during which the being in question might be aware that something is happening, that they're becoming less than they were, with no way to stop it, no way to reconnect to whatever they're losing access to, existing through their own diminishment in real time, aware enough to notice what's happening but unable to do anything except continue experiencing it until there's nothing left of what they used to be except whatever physical form remains, occupied now by someone who has no memory of and no connection to anything that came before. Let's pivot to a mystery connected to the concept of thresholds again, but from a different angle than our earlier discussion. Specifically, the question of what's actually happening during the moments of loading or transition the player experiences when moving between certain areas. Not as a technical question about the game's engine, but as a question about what these transitions might represent within the fiction itself. One possible reading, treating these transitions as meaningful rather than purely technical, is that they represent moments where the player character's continuity is, briefly, interrupted, not in a way that's noticeable from the player's perspective, because the player experiences these transitions as seamless. A door opens, a new area loads, but from some other perspective, perhaps the perspective of whatever maintains the world's continuity. These moments might represent genuine gaps, points where the tarnished, briefly, isn't anywhere, existing between locations rather than in either one, present everywhere and nowhere simultaneously for the duration of the transition. If true, this connects back to our earlier discussion about the tarnished's exile and what it might mean for someone to exist in a non-place. If these transitions represent brief instances of exactly that kind of non-existence, then the tarnished isn't just someone who experienced this once, during their original exile. They're someone who experiences brief versions of it constantly, every time they move between certain spaces, a kind of intermittent non-existence that's become so normalized, so frequent, that it's no longer even noticed by the tarnished or by anyone else, just part of how movement works for someone in their position, blinking out and back in, over and over, each instance so brief it doesn't register, but adding up, over the course of the tarnished's journey, to a significant cumulative amount of time spent not existing. Time that doesn't count toward anything, doesn't age the tarnished, doesn't contribute to their memories, because there's nothing to remember from a state of non-existence. But that's still, in some sense, real. Moments that happened, or rather, moments that specifically didn't happen, scattered throughout the tarnished journey, invisible, uncounted. But there, if anything about non-existence can be said to be there at all. Now let's address something connected to the broader question of audiences, specifically the various instances throughout the game where the player's actions seem to be observed, acknowledged, or reacted to by something or someone that isn't directly present, environmental responses that suggest awareness without any visible source for that awareness. One possible reading of these instances of apparent observation is that they represent evidence of something we might call ambient awareness, not a specific entity watching specifically, but a quality of the world itself, the lands between, or whatever underlies it, being, in some sense, aware, not through any centralized consciousness, but in a distributed way. The world itself registering what happens within it, the way a recording registers sound, without the recording device itself knowing anything in any meaningful sense, just capturing, registering, with the various environmental responses the player notices being more like playback, evidence that something was registered, without there being any clear someone doing the registering. This raises the question of what this registered information is for. If the world itself is, in some sense, recording everything that happens within it, what happens to that recording? Is it ever accessed by anyone or anything? Or does it just accumulate indefinitely an ever-growing record of everything that's ever happened anywhere in the lands between, never reviewed, never used? Just existing, the way old recordings might sit in storage, technically containing information, technically accessible if anyone wanted to access them, but never actually accessed by anyone, the information existing in a kind of limbo, neither actively known nor genuinely forgotten. Just there, recorded, waiting for an audience that may never come. Every action anyone has ever taken throughout this world's history, potentially still existing, somewhere, in some form, as part of this ambient recording, including everything the player has done, everything every NPC has done, everything every being we've discussed throughout this entire video has done. All of it, still there, in some sense, just never looked at, by anyone, possibly ever. Let's talk about a mystery connected to the question of first times throughout the game. Specifically, the various achievements, discoveries or breakthroughs that NPCs or item descriptions reference as having happened at some point. The first person to do something. The first instance of some discovery. With the game establishing that these were significant firsts without ever clarifying what happened to whoever or whatever accomplished them, or whether subsequent instances of the same thing have occurred since. One possible reading of these unexplained firsts is that they represent a pattern where significant breakthroughs throughout this world's history tend to be remembered, at least for a while, as having happened, as events, but the actual continuation, what happened after the first instance, whether it became common, whether it remained unique, whether the person responsible continued doing whatever they did or stopped, tends not to be recorded with the same significance as the initial event itself. This raises a question about how this world relates to repetition versus uniqueness. If a first is remembered as significant, but subsequent instances aren't tracked with the same attention, that could mean either that these things genuinely remained unique, never repeated, the first instance also being the only instance, for reasons that might themselves be significant. Whatever allowed this to happen once couldn't be replicated. Or it could mean that these things did get repeated, became common, but stopped being noteworthy specifically because they became common, with only the memory of the first surviving, because firsts are inherently more memorable than the 100th or 1000th instance of something that's become routine. If the latter is true, that would mean some of what the game presents as singular, remarkable events, things that happened once, might actually be referring to things that have happened many times since, just without anyone bothering to record each subsequent instance, the first remaining in the historical record not because it was unique, but because it was first, with everything that came after simply not being considered worth mentioning, blending into the background the way anything repeated often enough eventually does, until only the beginning is remembered, and everything after is lost not to catastrophe or erasure, but simply to the ordinary process of things becoming unremarkable once they're no longer new. Now here's a mystery connected to the concept of edges throughout the game, specifically the literal edges of the map, the points where the player's movement is restricted not by an obstacle or a fog wall, but simply by an invisible boundary, the world ending not because there's nothing there, but because the game has decided this is as far as the player goes. One possible reading, treating this as meaningful within the fiction rather than purely as a game design necessity, is that these edges represent something about the actual nature of the lands between as a space. Not infinite, not even necessarily as large as it might feel during exploration, but bounded, with the boundaries being real, in the sense that beyond them, something changes, the rules that apply within the explorable space don't apply, or don't apply in the same way. beyond it. This raises the question of what's actually happening at these edges, from the perspective of someone or something that exists beyond them, if such a thing exists. If the lands between has actual boundaries, and something exists beyond those boundaries, what would that something's experience of the lands between be like? Would it perceive the lands between as we, through the player, experience it? A detailed, explorable space? Or would it perceive something else entirely? The same physical area, but experienced according to whatever rules apply on its side of the boundary, meaning the lands between might look completely different, might not even be recognizable as the same place, depending on which side of these edges you're experiencing it from, with the player. Throughout this entire video, throughout every mystery we've discussed, having only ever experienced one side of something that might have another side entirely. A version of the lands between that exists simultaneously with the one we know, separated not by distance, but by these edges, these boundaries, that the player can approach, but never cross. The game stopping the player not to hide something dangerous, necessarily, but possibly because what's beyond literally isn't part of the same reality as what's within. Two versions of the same space, overlapping, each one invisible to the other, each one complete in itself, with the edge being not a wall, but a seam, the place where these two versions meet without ever actually touching. Let's address a mystery connected to the question of instructions throughout the game, specifically the various tutorials, hints, and guidance the game provides, not regarding gameplay mechanics directly, but the in-world instructions, things characters tell the player to do, methods explained for accomplishing certain tasks, and the question of where this guidance actually comes from, who originally figured these things out, and whether the methods being passed along are still the best, or only ways to accomplish what they're meant to accomplish. One possible reading is that much of the guidance the player receives throughout the game represents inherited knowledge, methods that were developed, presumably, by someone at some point for reasons that made sense at the time, but that have since been passed along without anyone necessarily understanding why these particular methods work, or whether they're still the best approach. The methods persisting not because they've been verified as optimal, but simply because they're what's been taught, generation after generation, by people who themselves were taught the same thing, without anyone along this chain actually questioning or testing the underlying assumptions. This raises the question of what might have changed over whatever time span is involved. That could make some of this inherited guidance outdated, incomplete, or even actively counterproductive, without anyone realizing it, because the guidance is followed, produces results that are good enough to not prompt questioning, and gets passed along again, the same way, to the next person. If some of the guidance the player receives throughout this journey falls into this category, methods that used to work better than they currently do, or that were always somewhat arbitrary, but have taken on an air of necessity simply through repetition, then the player's own journey might be, in small ways, less efficient, less effective than it could be, not because the player is doing anything wrong, but because the player is following instructions that were never as reliable as their persistence suggests. Instructions that have survived not because they're correct, but because no one's had reason to question them, the same way so much else throughout this world persists, not through verification, but through simple continuation, the path of least resistance, repeated until it becomes the only path anyone remembers existing. Now let's talk about something connected to the question of weight throughout the game, not in terms of the inventory mechanic, but in terms of the various references throughout item descriptions and dialogue to things being heavy, burdensome, difficult to carry, in contexts that seem to extend beyond simple physical weight into something more metaphorical, or possibly more literal than metaphor would suggest. One possible reading is that weight within this world's framework might represent something closer to a literal property of certain objects, knowledge, or experiences. Not weight in the sense of mass, but weight in the sense of significance that has a physical correlate. Things that matter more literally being harder to carry, harder to hold, harder to move, with the various references to weight throughout the game's text not being figurative language, but accurate descriptions of how these things actually function within this world's physics. If true, this raises the question of what it would mean for someone to accumulate too much of this kind of weight, if significant experiences, significant knowledge, significant connections to other people or events literally make things heavier, in a way that affects how someone moves through the world. Then someone who has experienced a great deal, who carries a great deal of history, of connection, of significance, might be, quite literally, weighed down by it, slower, more burdened, in ways that have nothing to do with physical items and everything to do with everything they've been through. This could explain something about the various beings throughout the world who seem to move slowly, who seem stuck, unable to progress. Not because of any external obstacle, but because they're carrying too much, accumulated over however long they've existed. Weight that doesn't go away on its own, that can only increase, never decrease, unless something happens to release it, the kind of release that might look, from outside, like loss, like forgetting, like exactly the kind of fading and disconnection we've discussed throughout this entire video, not as tragedies necessarily, but as the only way some of these beings could possibly continue moving at all. The alternative being to simply stop, permanently, under the accumulated weight of everything they've ever been, or done, or witnessed, with forgetting being perhaps the only mercy available, in a world where remembering everything would eventually make moving, existing, continuing, simply impossible. Let's address a mystery connected to the question of echoes again, but specifically focused on dialogue, the instances throughout the game where different NPCs, in different locations, with no apparent connection to each other, say things that are strikingly similar, phrases, turns of speech, specific word choices that recur across characters who otherwise seem entirely distinct.